All right, Josh. Nick Drake. 5 leaves left.
5 leaves left. 5 to go. All right, Nick Drake. And in the opening montage, you heard Fruit Tree, and now you're going to hear a little bit from Riverman. Nick Drake. Did you guys know much about him or who he is before this?
I knew some.
I had not listened to him.
Sorry, go ahead, John.
I just knew his name because he's often dropped, but I did not know much of his work, no.
Yeah.
I knew some of his work. I know a little bit about him as a person, but not a ton.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know anything about him either. So he lived had a short career and a short life, unfortunately. But 5 Leaves Left, it was released July 3rd, 1969. It's currently 30th on Best Ever Albums of the 60s. Nick Drake was born in 1948 in Burma, which is now Myanmar, to be politically correct. His father was an engineer, and that's what took him over there. And then he died in 1974 at the age of 26. He released this album when he was 21, and this is his debut album. Now, part of it, I'll say up front, he suffered from major depression his entire life, and he, as a result, he only released 3 albums, and it's said he died of an overdose of antidepressants. The doctor ruled it a suicide, but it could have been an accidental overdose as well. So that's ultimately what killed him. Factoring in the depression, he did not like to be performed live or to be interviewed. There's no known video footage of him. Only photographs and home video footage from his childhood exist. Another thing contributing to his depression, I'm sure, was he never saw success while he was alive. His album sold very little upon release. It was very much posthumously that he became popular and influential among many artists. Also, the antidepressant that he was taking was amitriptyline, which the brand name is Elavil, and that antidepressant is now discontinued by the FDA, and it's a different type of antidepressant, and with the popularity of SSRIs, they've kind of replaced that type of antidepressant. But anyway, he started out after coming back from Burma as a child. In England, he played multiple instruments in high school, including piano, clarinet, and saxophone, and that's kind of where he got his music start. He started playing in bands at that time as well. In 1965, he bought his first acoustic guitar and was self-taught. He learned finger picking and open chords himself. In 1967, he moved into London to his sister's place and enrolled at Fitzwilliam College, which is part of the Cambridge University system. So he's one of those English children who went from boarding school to grade school into the university system. It was at this time that in college, that he discovered British and American folk music. It was also during this time that he discovered marijuana, which he was a big fan of and pretty much smoked constantly, from what quotes were given about that. It was at this time he also started performing at bars and coffee houses in London. It was discovered by Ashley Hutchings, who was the bass player of Fairport Convention, who we touched on way back in episode 3 of Combing Stacks. Ashley introduced him to Joe Boyd, who was a 25-year-old American producer working in the UK and was considered influential in the folk scene there. And after Boyd heard a demo of Drake playing, he offered him a contract with his record label or production company called Witchfinder, which was a part of Island Records. Nick Drake recorded this initial album in 1968. Boyd was the producer and was inspired by Leonard Cohen's debut, which we have not talked about yet, but will be coming up soon, I believe, in future episodes. And he wanted a similar style for Nick Drake. This included string arrangements, which you guys heard, and backing from local folk musicians such as Fairport Convention's guitarist Richard Thompson and Danny Thompson from Pentangle, which was another prominent folk band at that time. The initial recordings did not go well. There was differences in opinion between Drake and Boyd as to the direction of the album. They were both unhappy with the arranger, Richard Anthony Hewson. So Nick Drake encouraged or wanted his friend to come in and do the arrangements from school, Robert Kirby, and so he was brought in with some trepidation, but he proved them wrong, and he did almost all the arrangements on this album except for the arrangement on Riverman. There were also post-production difficulties, and the album was poorly marketed and supported by Island Records. It received very little radio play, and Drake was also unhappy because the album information on the inlay was wrong. They had songs in the wrong order. It was mistitled in one track, and lyrics that were printed that weren't in the final versions of the songs that were recorded. Reviews of this album by the press were also mixed. And the title of the album is a reference to an old Rizla cigarette papers packet, which used to contain a printed note near the end saying only 5 leaves left. So after this album was released, he started to retreat more and more from live performances. He had some negative experiences from crowds opening for bands like Fairport Convention. Later on, he would sometimes leave mid-set, and because his songs were in different tunings between songs, he would just sit between songs tuning the guitar and not saying anything on stage, and so not a good way to keep an audience interested in what you're doing.
No, I would imagine that would not be a dynamic live performance.
Yeah. So in 1971, he released his second album, Brighter Later. It has a more pop and jazzier sound with some drum and bass tracks in it, as Drake wanted to get away from the pastoral sound of this album. His depression also worsened during this time, and his family made him see a psychiatrist, and he was prescribed antidepressants at this time. He was still smoking marijuana regularly, and he was hesitant to take antidepressants because he didn't want it to affect his marijuana use. And his friend Robert Kirby described him as smoking, quote, unbelievable amounts of cannabis. And he started also showing signs of psychosis during this time. So that's pretty severe depression if you're showing signs of psychosis. One doctor actually said that he thought he had schizophrenia and not major depressive disorder. But his sister said that this time period is when things started to go wrong as well. Then he put out his third album in 1972 titled Pink Moon, and that's very stripped down. It's only him and his guitar on the entire album, with the exception of a piano opening on the opening track. This sold even less than the other two albums, and he decided to retire from music after this. He moved back in with his parents and became increasingly depressed. He was hospitalized at one point, and in 1974, he actually returned to the studio to record tracks for what would be his fourth album. And when he got to the studio, he was dirty and disheveled. He had long hair and dirty fingernails, and he could no longer sing and play the guitar at the same time. So then, unfortunately, he died in his bedroom at his parents' home in 1974. He came down to get some food and said he was going to take some pills to help him sleep, and then his mom found him the next day. The initial coroner's report said that it was suicide by antidepressant overdose, and then his family has, kind of said they don't necessarily agree with that. That's kind of where the discrepancy comes in. There was no posthumous articles or documentaries about him upon his death. All of his albums sold less than 5,000 copies. However, Joe Boyd did do a service to Drake because in his contract with Island Records, it said that his music is never to go out of print. So that's why it's never necessarily been forgotten. It wasn't until the 80s that artists started name-checking him as inspiration. People like Kate Bush, Robert Smith of The Cure, which has a song, or actually the name of the band is a reference to Nick Drake. The Black Crowes, Peter Buck of REM, they've all said that they were influenced by Nick Drake. In the late 90s, the BBC started putting out documentaries about him, which renewed interest as well. And then in 1999, a song from Pink Moon, the third album, appeared in a Volkswagen Cabrio commercial, which renewed interest. And then he also started appearing on movie soundtracks like Garden State and Royal Tenenbaums, which is where I think I first heard him, was on that Garden State soundtrack. And I looked up that Volkswagen commercial, and I definitely remember that commercial as well. And that's a good song. So I think that's why it stuck with me. So, yeah, that's kind of the whole, unfortunately, that's the whole story of his life in a nutshell and his recording career. There is just those 3 albums, and then there's some material that were from recordings that were released after the fact, but there's no really other material, so you can hear pretty much everything in 3 albums that he produced.
And we're covering the other 2, aren't we?
I don't know, actually.
I think we are.
I believe so.
70s.
I believe
Okay.
they're all on the list. Yep.
Okay, so yeah, so we'll hear them all, and we'll get the full picture of Nick Drake. But Matt, what did you think about listening to this album?
So I like I said, I knew Nick Drake coming into this, maybe initially from movies as well, Josh, because he did certainly get a little bit of a resurgence in some like indie films and things like that. I also know that he's kind of like a darling in the indie music world. There's been songs that friends of mine have made mixes for me, and Nick Drake has made his way onto some of those mixes. I'm not a huge fan of him, not a huge fan of this record. I hate using the word boring, but that's kind of how I felt with this record. I think my biggest issue with this album is the orchestration. The orchestra, I think there's parts of this album that I like with the guitar playing, and I would say that probably my favorite song is the opening track, "Time Has Told Me." It's more of a it's as upbeat as he gets. It's not as somber, and there's a little bit of slide guitar going on in there. It's a little bit of a country feel, which I do enjoy that type of sound. But he is a good guitar player. There's some really intricate finger picking going on here. It's been a while since we've heard some Sad Bastard music, and this is certainly this is Sad Bastard music.
He's one of the saddest, I think.
Yeah, and all that talk about depression and just all that stuff. This album sounds like depression.
Yes.
I tried to listen to the lyrics here and there, kind of took, but not really. It's not my thing. But it doesn't do a whole lot for me, and I would like to like Nick Drake. I know that he's seen as I know a lot of people revere him, and he's held in very high regard. It's sad that he's one of those artists that wasn't really appreciated until after his death, before he got to really see any benefits of the work that he did. So it is a very sad story, but like the cello song, it's just like the verses are okay, and then the cello comes in and the humming part, it's just like it's overly sad and overly depressing, I think. And I do like sad and depressing music, and that's the thing. It's not like this is totally out of my wheelhouse, but he just takes it. Nick Drake somehow finds a way to take it to the next level. and it's just, and I'm just like, it doesn't really hit a chord with me at all. And I maybe the other albums, I don't know any of his albums very well, so this is the first real foray into his stuff for me. So I know Pink Moon is like his it's his Trout Mask replica, if you will.
It's the most like
yeah.
him, I guess.
Yeah, it's his greatest work. So I'm interested to see there's other albums maybe without the orchestration on that record. I will like it more, because I definitely think that did a disservice here. I think it was too much. I don't think it was needed.
Yeah. But
even with taking that away, the overall sonic palette of this was just a little bit much for me, and I was unimpressed as an overall feel. So
okay. John, what about you?
Um, it's on one hand, he has a beautiful warm tone to his voice, doesn't he?
I do like his singing.
Yeah, he has a really nice voice and it's warm, which is interesting because it does. I think you said it sounds kind of like. I've always used the example that if you want to hear what like depression sounds like, you listen to like Dirt by Alice in Chains, right? Like Lane Staley on that album. It's like you imagine it's what it's like to be depressed and do heroin, right? And there's a certain sound, and I wouldn't say it's as clear to me that what you're hearing is depression on this. I do think that you're hearing extreme sensitivity and sort of a gentleness, but also a gentleness that's very fragile in terms of his voice. So you get a lot from it. I liked Nick Drake's songs, but it felt to me after a while that the same song was being replicated over and over again. And I think the lack of variety for me was what didn't sell me on this album as much. I actually think this album in some ways was very similar to an album we covered very early on, the Tim Buckley album, in some ways. But that had I actually like Nick Drake's voice a little bit better, and I like his songs better, but there was more variety on the Tim Buckley album, and so I look at them very similar. Sort of misunderstood geniuses in their own way who died young, but who I don't ever think I'll pick up the album and listen to it again, because I think one of the things that is difficult for me is when it's hard for me to relate to the type of pain that Nick Drake has, if that makes sense.
That's a good thing, John.
No, it is. No, I mean, it sounds terrible to say, but it's like, I do feel that to some degree, kind of like the Captain Beefheart album, you have to be a little off the beaten path to some degree in terms of your personality to get it, I think. And the Pink Floyd album, you have to do LSD to do it. I think this is one where you have to be a real, deeply feeling person who can relate to sort of that pervasive hopelessness that's in the album, and I can't totally, and so as a result it always feels somewhat detached for me, like I'm at a distance, and based on what Josh said about his life, his music is like his life, it sounds like, kind of at a distance, and that would be how I'd put this album. It has its virtues, but I don't know if I'd ever revisit it, to be honest.
It's interesting because this reminds me of so many male singer-songwriters, right? Like Bon Iver or John Mayer or Iron and Wine. I feel like they're all kind of indebted to Nick Drake in some way. But this, I had a hard time connecting with this album as well. And like you, John, it did feel kind of samey despite being a very short album. It's interesting, there's kind of a dichotomy between, it has like gentle, peaceful sounding music, but the lyrics themselves are very like introspective and searching and melancholy, and maudlin was another word that came
That's
to mind.
Great word. That's a great word to describe this album.
And it's very much, depending on the song, it's about like hopelessness or about death or loss or like finding who you are or trying to connect with people. And it seemed like that reflected in his life. Like he had a very hard time connecting with people, and that comes through in these songs. Unlike you, Matt, I did like the string arrangements on this album. I thought those were standout to me. And he is a very good, like John said, like you both said, he is a good guitar player with a good voice. So he, that has a strength for him. We'll be listening to his albums in order, coincidentally. So I'll be interested to see what the next two sound like, and maybe like you guys will connect more on one of the other two. But yeah, it's surprising to me a little bit that this album is so high on the list.
Yeah.
But
do you think some of that is that people can't help themselves with the tragic artist a little bit? I can't help but think
the romantic, tragic
figure. It's like I always struggle with that. You know what I mean? Because there's plenty of artists who, I think it's the argument always when someone dies young. Like how do you context them, or does it elevate the does it elevate and there's just a romanticism to that, doomed romantic type
Right.
of feel,
Yeah.
Well, and Nick Drake too has become an artist that's cool to like. Like it's hip to like Nick Drake, and and that's what I'm saying. Like I just know that so many people like him, and he's not an overall in the grand scheme of things. He's not a well-known artist. It's
Right.
not like you drop his name, most people never heard of Nick Drake. So that's why it's kind of like the cool underground thing to do, and it's like this is like a Pitchfork, type of artist that they would be like, this is one of the greatest of all time, and you're just okay. I'm listening to it, and I'm like you, John. I think I'm not going to go back to this, and I'm not saying, and I do like his voice, and I think that some of the things that you're saying about that is right, but there's other artists that I would rather like. Sun Kill Moon is a good example of someone that's somewhat similar to this, and the stuff that he does. And I don't love all of his stuff, I forget that guy's name. It's the guy from the bass. He played the bass player in Almost Famous, but he does he was in Red House Painters, and he's got he does his own stuff. But it's a very similar to melancholy type of sound, but it's more interesting. I connect with it more. So so this is a little bit, like I said, it's a little bit in my wheelhouse. But the way that Drake does it. Nick Drake, the way that Nick Drake does it is
very different feel to the other Drakes.
Very different feel. Yeah, I probably would rather listen to the other Drake, but this is just blah. It's just a whole lot of nothing, and I don't connect with him.
Yep. Yeah. He seems in retrospect like the perfect artist to put on a mixtape or on a soundtrack, because like one song would probably fit in really well. But like listening to a whole album of it,
that's a great way to put it, Josh.
Work.
I felt that way too. I felt like if I heard individual songs, I might feel differently. But when you get an overall theme of that cascading depression, it can wear on you a little bit. And it's the second straight week where there is an album that in this time of uncertainty, it was not an easy listen, which I don't need my albums to be sparkly and optimistic. I don't, but between this and Trout Mask Replica, it wasn't a struggle to listen to this a second time, but certainly I wouldn't say that it was a pleasure. It left me not wanting to go to that headspace again, I guess would be a good way to put it.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if like all those people who really like Nick Drake, does it have something to do with the timing, right? Are we looking at an artist that was doing something that was just unique in that time? I mean, I will say it's not a dated record. It sounds like something that's that could be done today, but it's also because it's very stripped down and there's not a whole lot of production behind it, so you don't, it's not going to have that dated feel, but. I don't know.
Well,
I do wonder why he's so revered. Is John, the lyrics, are they really like
they're
profound?
fine, but I'll tell you what I think it is. I think it's that a lot of musicians themselves struggle with a lot of these same concepts, and to see someone who's like a true archetype of the suffering artist who isn't appreciated for his art till later, I think there's a lot of artists that look at that as very authentic. Not that you're not authentic if you're Jim Morrison or Jimi Hendrix, but both of those guys were very appreciated in their own time. So you know what I mean? It's not they died young, but they died young for the masses. Kind of in the same way that like a Tupac or a Kurt Cobain, right? They transcended it and they did it. So who do you look for as sort of your archetype of like the musician with the authenticity and sort of the rare? You look for somebody a little bit under the radar, I think. And I think there's a little bit of that going on. And I don't want to undersell Nick Drake, but I do think that's a little bit of what the appeal is.
Well, he certainly is authentic. This guy is laying it all out there, and you say whatever we want about him, but that's definitely true. Yeah. So but like I said, the guy's name from Sun Kill Moon is Mark Kozelek, and that's a similar type of artist. He does have that kind of the morose, very somber, almost depressed, but he's got a little bit more variety in his stuff for me, at least with a couple of his albums, and I'm like I connect with it a little bit more, but I hope I like the other stuff, because like I said, I think that this is an artist that has the potential for me to like, but this was not the album for. If more of the songs were like the opening track, which was a little bit, and maybe one of the reasons I liked it more, because A, there was no orchestration, and B, it was it was as upbeat as I think he was getting, at least in terms of the music, the sonic sound that you were getting. That slide guitar he should do more slide guitar in his pep it up a little bit, but clearly that's not where his mind was, and he probably needed to do the sounds that he did. So yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So there we go.
Yeah. We're
Probably
all a little bit more depressed now.
Probably the most morose bio that we have had on the entire time. That makes 2 straight weeks where Josh has had a hell of a bio to do. So,
and Josh, you were thumbs down on every album this week. This was a rough week for you.
I know. I was a little hesitant going in to be so negative, but that's how I felt. So
you got to be real, man. You got to be real.
You got to go
real like Nick